The Cisco Identity Services Engine uses a hierarchical policy system to control network access, and policy sets are at the top of this hierarchy. A policy set serves three key interrelated functions. It is a container for logically grouped authentication and authorization policies. It uses Boolean conditions to steer users to the appropriate group of policies for network authentication and authorization. And it limits that authorization session to a set of allowed protocols. Now, when creating policy, you may need to group authentication and authorization policies based on some criteria, and you accomplish this by creating policy sets. In this example, the grouping is based on use case. Policy set 1 controls how wired users gain access, while policy set 2 controls how wireless users gain access. Another common method is to create policy sets based on location. Users in a particular region, campus, or building may have unique authentication and authorization needs. You can use any criteria appropriate to your organization. They are called policy sets because each one contains a unique set of authentication or Auth-C policies and a unique set of authorization or Auth-Z policies. You create a policy set by configuring three items: a name, conditions, and a resultant set of allowed protocols. Look at the policy set named PolSet1. If a user attempts to access the network via a wired Ethernet switch, then PolSet1 is selected. Thus, they are only allowed to authenticate using MAB or EAP-TLS. They will be authenticated based on the rules contained in Auth-C Policy 1 and authorized to access certain resources via the Auth-Z Policy 1 policy. Policy sets are processed top-down, very much like an access list. Because PolSet1 is listed first, its conditions are checked first. If those conditions are not met, in other words, it's not a wired user, then PolSet2 is checked. PolSet2 will be used for wireless endpoints. These users may only authenticate via PEEP or EAP-TLS, and they are authenticated with Auth-C Policy 2 rules and authorized with Auth-Z Policy 2. So, policy sets are the top level of the Cisco ISE policy system. The second level of this hierarchy is the actual policies for authentication and for authorization. Authentication policies control which databases to check for user credentials, the so-called identity source, or an identity source sequence. Each policy set can have only one authentication policy, but that policy can have multiple rules. Now, this one has two rules, process top-down. First rule, if the user attempts MAB authentication, their credentials are checked against a single identity source, the Cisco ISE internal user database. If this MAB condition is not met, then the second rule is checked. If we're using 802.1x, then an identity source sequence is applied. First, Active Directory AD1 is checked, and then LDAP database LDAP1 is checked. So, the user is authenticated, but what actions will you let this user perform? Authorization policy controls which resources a user can access. Again, only one authorization policy per policy set, which can have several rules. This example determines access based on Active Directory group membership. So, members of the employees group are given appropriate employee-level access, while members of the contractors group are limited to a smaller set of resources. Let's review this process from a user's perspective when they're attempting to access your network. Network access services are chosen at the policy set level. Identity sources are chosen via the authentication policy, and network permissions are chosen via the authorization policy. Check it out. Users use some method to connect to a network access device, which engages the authentication policy. Cisco ISE evaluates contextual information related to this connection and compares this against the authentication policy conditions. When it finds a match, a particular ID store is selected, or a sequence of stores are chosen. User credentials are checked against this identity store. Invalid credentials result in a failed authentication, access denied. Valid credentials result in a successful authentication. Then, the authorization policy is processed, along with the other services as shown here. But for now, we're focused on authentication. Each authentication rule has three components: name, set of conditions, and resulting identity source. The name is any arbitrary name that makes sense to you, perhaps matching some corporate naming convention. A condition consists of an operand or attribute, an operator, and a value. This simple rules condition states if radius NAS port type equals Ethernet. If this condition is met, then the Cisco ISE queries its internal user database for credentials. The TLS rule strings conditions together with a Boolean AND operator. If the certificate serial number equals 74501742 and the network access EAP authentication type equals EAP TLS, then a sequence of servers can be checked for credentials. The actual servers to be checked are defined in identity source sequence named all user ID stores. And notice that the attribute has the format dictionary:@dictionary-attribute. The words radius and certificate are dictionaries. Inside each dictionary are a list of related attributes, like NAS port type and serial number. Let's explore these dictionaries, which provide fundamental building blocks for Cisco ISE policies. It's a collection of individual parameters used when configuring conditions, like our example here. Conditions are used to build authentication and authorization policies. Conditions specify constraints on session attributes, which are used to define which policies to apply. So, that's the key components of an authentication policy: the policy rules themselves, the dictionary attributes used to build conditions, and the resultant identity source or source sequences.